On the 21st of May, Australians will be voting for their next government and they will decide who will become Australia's new Prime Minister. Voting is compulsory in the election and over 17 million are set to vote this time. These Australians will be voting for all the seats in the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives has 151 seats, 76 of which are needed for a majority to form the government. The race is between the Conservative Liberal National Coalition and the Labour Party. The Liberal National Coalition is seeking a fourth straight term. Meanwhile, the Labour Party is seeking a return to power. Opinion polls have shown Labour leading, but the gap has narrowed in the final weeks of campaigning. So will Prime Minister Scott Morrison return to power? Morrison's term was consumed by the COVID-19 pandemic, so his campaign is also built around that. While Australia's infections and death toll is not high, his response to the virus came at the steep cost.
As you would expect us to.
Inflation is at 5.1%, the highest level since 2001. To tackle this, Australia's central bank has stepped in. They have raised interest rates for the first time since 2010. And what impact will that have? More interest equals less money in hand. Scott Morrison has tried to distance himself from this decision, but the opinion polls indicate otherwise. The other leader everyone is talking about is Anthony Albanese. He is contesting to be Australia's next Prime Minister. Albanese is a career politician. He served as the Deputy Prime Minister in 2013. His election pitch is based on 5 major promises: cheaper medicines, building resilient supply chains, closing the gender pay gap, shifting to green vehicles, and bringing down the housing prices. So what about foreign policy? China is a big factor in the Australian politics. Anthony Albanese says China is a bipartisan issue in Australia. Meanwhile, Scott Morrison has accused Albanese of working for China. Morrison, on the other hand, is hawkish on Beijing. He strengthened ties with the Quad. He took Australia into AUKUS. He called out China's unofficial trade embargo, even demanded a probe into the origins of COVID-19. The other important issue in these elections being climate change. Climate change is becoming the biggest concern, in fact, for Australians. Australia has witnessed some of the worst bushfires and floods in history. Both major parties have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, but they are still supporting Australia's mining industry, and this may push voters to other parties like the Greens. So who is likely to win this time around? The results will be out by Sunday. If no party gets a majority, they will have to form a pact with other parties, which means that negotiations could drag on for days. Opinion polls suggesting that the Labour may win by a narrow majority, but the opinion polls have been widely inaccurate in the past. And let's break this down further for you. With us on the broadcast this minute is Dr. Benjamin Herskovich from Sydney. He is a research fellow at the Centre for International Governance and Justice. Benjamin, thanks very much for being here with us. As we saw, the race is quite tight, which basically means that Scott Morrison, the incumbent leader, has not really got things going in his favour. A lot of factors seem to be working against him. What, according to you, has not really worked out well for him?
There are a few big problems that he has faced over the course of the last few months in the lead up to the campaign and during the campaign. One of the key issues is that he personally is not liked by a really large portion of the electorate. There have been a number of really quite dramatic instances of him appearing to be out of touch with many Australians, him appearing to be a little callous, a little uncaring. Things like when he was holidaying in Hawaii as there were massive bushfires ravaging Australia. And when he returned to Australia, he seemed to not be particularly taking it seriously and to not be engaging with the issue. There's also this long-standing concern in Australia, which is rising, related to climate change. Of course, this has been a big policy and political issue for many years, but I think we're now reaching a point where it's cutting through with a broader range of voters that previously might have not have prioritized climate change. And Scott Morrison is perceived to have effectively dropped the ball on climate change and not pushed forward with a strong enough set of policy proposals to tackle climate change. And that's why we're seeing the rise of a few really prominent independents in a couple of seats which would have previously been very strong government seats, but there are many particularly wealthier voters in traditional conservative seats who are effectively saying, look, we are sick of the government dragging their feet on climate change. We want action now. And that's building into this resentment with the government. And then there have been some scandals associated with instances of alleged sexual abuse against women working in parliament. And the government, again, was perceived to not be doing enough, not be taking the issue seriously enough, and too often adopting a fairly callous, uncaring approach. So Scott Morrison, the man himself, is on the nose with the electorate. And then on top of that, there are big macroeconomic factors like inflation, which is rising at a rapid rate and eating away at the purchasing power of ordinary Australians. There are a lot of Australians who have suffered greatly during COVID lockdowns, people working in the services industry in particular. And often those are people who are not able to own lavish homes and they are living paycheck to paycheck. And in the context of rising inflation, that makes their situation even worse. And so the economic indicators are pretty challenging for the government as well.
Right. Benjamin, inflation in Australia hit a 20-year high in April. So whoever comes to power next will have to deal with these immediate economic challenges with the increased rate of borrowing and the rising cost of living. To what extent will these economic issues determine the outcome, according to you?
I think economic factors are always absolutely critical in Australian elections. If you look back over the course of decades, governments and oppositions often stake their credibility on their ability to keep interest rates low or to provide job growth or to provide economic growth more broadly. It's almost always one of the most fundamentally important questions for electors going into the polling booth every election. But as you say, there are a range of factors this time around which make the choice especially challenging. And Australia has not confronted the kind of economic headwinds that it's currently facing for many, many decades. Since the 1990s, we had this long-standing period of uninterrupted economic expansion, this period of generally low interest rates, this massive mining boom associated with the Australian commodities industry is being able to export vast amounts of valuable commodities abroad. And Australians haven't had to grapple with challenging economic times as they are right now. The COVID shock put an end to a lot of that. We experienced our first recession for many decades. The jobless rate went up really dramatically at that time. But since then, the jobless rate has fallen back, but we're now facing things like inflation driven by big international events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and that seems to be going nowhere. And the likelihood is that whoever is able to form government will deal with a much more complex, much more challenging economic situation, particularly in the context of vast amounts of government debt for the Australian government as a result of all of these additional measures put in place to assist Australians deal with the aftershocks of COVID. So it will be hard to justify a big spending agenda to offset the difficulties that Australians are facing economically. And then on top of that, one key factor which has been bubbling away for many decades in Australia, but which is reaching boiling point, if you like, is this issue of housing prices. If you go to large Australian cities like Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane, they are staggeringly expensive. And a huge portion of Australians are effectively priced out of the housing market in large urban areas in the country. And there are very wealthy older generations who are able to hand their properties onto their children and their grandchildren. But huge numbers of Australians see home ownership as something which is no longer realistic for them. And culturally for Australians, the notion of being able to purchase your home at some point in time is considered to be this really important priority. And when that is out of reach for a growing number of Australians, that breeds a great deal of discontent, frustration, and in some cases, hopelessness, I think. And so that's feeding into the election as well. And to be frank, neither major party is putting forward a viable set of policy options to deal with that housing affordability issue, which goes to the point that we've been discussing, that regardless whoever forms government, we'll be dealing with long-standing, big economic and pricing challenges for the Australian people.
Thanks very much, Benjamin, for sharing those perspectives with us. WION now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.